Hello, everybody. It's September the 11th, 2021. Of course, September the 11th is one of the dark days in American history, 20-year anniversary after the original 9/11 outrage. In tech, it hasn't been a great week for Apple, although perhaps Keith argues that it's been a slightly better week than the media is presenting. So, Keith, we've talked a little bit about Apple and its App Store and what it can and can't do. What's happened this week?
So, yeah, it's interesting. Last week, the newsletter's title was The App Store Wars, and it was about what's going on in South Korea and Japan. Yesterday, the judge in the Epic Apple case released her verdict, and her verdict actually has been widely, the press has been all over the place in basically trying to figure out what it all means. Apple declared victory. Epic acknowledged loss. And then various commentators have said, well, Apple has won the battle, but is going to lose the war. And it's all buried inside this judge's ruling. So I think this week my subtitle is, Did Apple Win? It's complicated. And it is complicated.
I mean, the stuff I read in the FT suggested that Apple lost, but explain simply what happened then. What was the judge's ruling?
Well, it was 180 pages, so there's a lot. But
and of course, I know you read all 180 very carefully, didn't you? Because you are in another life a legal scholar of the highest quality, Keith.
Just a very experienced operator who's had to deal with a law in tech for 40 years, but not a scholar. But so let's unpack it. The first and most important part of the ruling was that the definition of the market that was being judged was narrowed down by the judge to the mobile gaming market for in-app purchases.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a broad ruling about everything. It was about a very specific market segment. Within that market segment, the judge concluded, firstly, that Apple is not a monopoly, that the case has not been made that Apple is a monopoly, which is very similar to what another judge concluded vis-a-vis Facebook a couple of weeks ago.
But it's hard to make the argument it's a monopoly given Android platform. I just don't see how it's possible to even make that argument.
Yeah, and the web.
And I mean, what percentage even of the app market does Apple have? It's 20, 25%?
Measured by the number of apps, but it's about 90% measured by the revenue.
Okay.
Now, the second part,
which suggests that Apple is a smarter company than Google in that sense, at least.
Yeah, I think that's true. Or as its demographic, the people who buy iPhones have more money than people who buy Android phones.
And also, the Apple business model is never to give anything away for free; to always charge. So it makes more sense for Apple to be fighting this war than Google.
Yeah, exactly. Although just to add a bit of nuance, almost every app in the App Store is free and no one pays anything because it's all advertising supported. But that said, the second part of the ruling and the bit where people conclude that Apple may have lost is that the judge said that Apple should allow a third-party game to put a button or a link to an alternate payment system. Logistically, that's not much of a win, because if you think about, my kids play games like Fortnite is one of their games, which is Epic. And in-game purchases, the last thing you want to do is click on something, go out of the game, and then come back in. So it isn't much of a victory, but people like MG Siegler are concluding that this is the beginning of the end of the App Store as we know it. In other words, the writing's on the wall, because eventually Apple is going to have to allow payment systems other than its own. So that's the bit where it says, well, this is the start of Apple's downfall.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I'm impressed with Epic. I mean, they've taken on a $2 trillion company, and they've done it with a degree of success. So you have to admire Epic, at least for their chutzpah in business terms, whether or not you agree with what they're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, it's a bit like you can admire Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan without necessarily agreeing with them.
Well, actually, it's the reverse. It's a bit like you can admire the Viet Cong for driving the Americans out, even if you don't much care for their politics or strategy,
Yeah,
or
that
even
was.
Al Qaeda, or certainly the Taliban. You're an admirer of the Taliban, Keith, aren't you? They beat the Americans.
I'm not an admirer of the Taliban at all because I'm an atheist, but I do. I did note this week that the Americans when the first commercial jet out of Kabul landed in Qatar, the American government complimented the Taliban for the working relationship and the professionalism
Yeah.
and so on.
So
Which
does Epic have a little bit of the Taliban in them in terms of taking on a big power and winning in a sense?
my personal opinion, as you probably know, is that Epic is trying to leverage the Apple ecosystem without paying Apple, and to me, that is basically freeloading.
Yeah, but it requires a great deal of chutzpah. You've got to admire them. I mean, how big are Epic? What's their market cap?
They're huge because
Well, not
Fortnite.
huge, but I mean, they're not huge in Apple huge or Google huge.
Um,
What's their market cap?
you're
20,
asking,
30, 50 bill?
okay, so you make a guess, and I'll tell you if you're right.
40 billion.
You think they're 40 billion.
And what
Well,
do you think they are?
the true the true answer is I can't find them. Are they listed?
They're a private company.
Yeah, yeah. I
We could
don't know.
probably buy them, Keith. Maybe we should acquire them and make them part of That Was the Week.
Yeah, so I don't know what they're worth, but
Well, they certainly. You've got to admire these small companies for taking on big tech, whether or not you agree with what they're trying to do, whether it's taking on Facebook or Google or Apple or certainly Amazon. And this is as you say, this is the beginning of the wars. I mean, of all the big tech companies, Apple's the one I like the most, but they're certainly by far from being a perfect. So this is
so
good that they're being challenged in the courts, that their power is being now really analyzed, isn't it?
here's Epic. Most recently they raised $1 billion.
Yeah.
That
So
was very.
they're a little company. I mean, maybe for in Silicon Valley terms, they're a little company. So they're clearly they've clearly achieved a great deal in legal terms. So what's the next step, Keith? How are we going to know whether or not Epic or Apple really won this one? Because as you suggest, it's kind of a draw at the moment.
I think
And
we'll.
Americans don't do draws very well. We in England love a draw, especially a 0-0. But
It,
um,
it's
we
going to
always want victors and losers.
so it's going to be years because firstly, Apple will appeal the ruling, the part of the ruling they don't like. So it's literally going to be years, and during that time, the value of Apple's ecosystem to developers like Epic is worth billions and billions of dollars a year. If that ecosystem were to become unraveled, most developers would suffer. So whereas Epic might win, most developers wouldn't, because most developers aren't going to go and build a billing system and do everything that
But
Apple
what
does.
about, and this is the theme you and I argue about all the time, what about the idea that this might provide an opening for someone other than Apple or Google to develop a store for developers that could change the dynamics of the app business?
Very hard to do because the device is the key. The App Store is subservient to the device, and so the Android devices and the iOS devices are pretty impenetrable. You'd have to build a new smartphone ecosystem, not just an App Store.
So it's
And
not going to happen. So here's a question for you, Keith: Is the Epic Apple battle war, is that going to be resolved before we have the final bank? Because you're suggesting this week that banks are an endangered species as well.
yeah, there's a few articles about that. Two different takes actually. The first one, let's click on it. The first one is from Bill Gurley, and this relates to a story about IPOs, where historically banks have taken companies public, have in the words of Bill Gurley, underpriced those IPOs and ran off into the hills with lots of
Yeah,
billions.
well, Gurley has his own interests here. He's hardly he's certainly not an unbiased observer of this.
But recently, to be fair to him, direct listings have worked very well
Yeah.
without giving money to the banks. And so, there is the writing on the wall for the traditional IPO. But the more interesting of the two.
But let me ask this before you get to the second: is can banks survive if they lose, if IPOs go away and everything becomes a direct listing of one kind or another?
Banks can
How
take.
central is the IPO market to these banks?
It's very small. Banks. Most of banks' revenue doesn't come from startups going
Okay.
public, so it's quite small. I think, and when we say the word banks, I mean most of
Yeah.
the people watching us should know we need to distinguish. This is investment banks that we're talking about here, like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs that do IPOs. We're not
Yeah.
talking about Wells Fargo or Bank of America or
Yeah.
Barclays or whatever.
Or let alone the new players, the Squares and the PayPals, who are kind of like banks, right?
Yeah. Now,
Uh, and the
but
crypto, Coinbase, and who are also, in a sense, replacing banks.
yeah. Now, in this second couple of stories, basically, the New York Times wrote an article. Was it the New York Times? Yeah.
Yeah.
The New York Times wrote an article basically saying that banks were threatened by the rise of crypto middlemen who were doing loans and debt, and they named BlockFi as one of those companies. I've used
Yeah.
BlockFi myself, and it is incredible. You can deposit dollars and get over 20% interest annually on your dollars deposited due
Yeah.
to how they operate. So clearly, you're not going to get that from a high street bank. So this is about the threat facing high street banks, asking the question, what value do they really give to consumers?
None, I think. As you've suggested, I mean, they're increasingly just for poor people, not indigenous, indigent people, I think, go to high
Yeah.
street banks, unless we absolutely have to.
Now, like with all innovation, the key point is this: state and federal regulators and some members of Congress want to protect the banks because they're status quo people. Innovation that threatens the status quo is a problem to them. So the New York Times was mainly writing about that. There was then a
Which
reaction.
is true. I mean, banks do it. I mean, it's still one of the few jobs you can get, which is not highly skilled, which gets you off the minimum wage. So I'm not sure if we should celebrate the closing of the retail bank on the high street. It's obviously annoying in some ways, but on the other hand, it does provide real jobs.
Well, to be honest, there's a strange alliance here between the Elizabeth Warren view of the world, where banks and credit card companies are screwing the normal person and
Yeah.
giving nothing back, and the crypto industry, which is really not doing that, promises to really help ordinary people do very well with their money.
Yeah, we've heard this one before, though. We had this with media and it didn't work out so well. So I don't trust. I mean, I believe maybe some of the crypto people mean what they say, but I don't see crypto working out in any way for the benefit of ordinary people any more than the current banking situation. I just don't believe.
Well, think of it this way: did the internet work out well for ordinary people?
Well, that's arguable. That's a long debate, but probably not generally.
Well,
I mean, it's created enormous inequalities, different kind of labor, but that's a broader conversation. But certainly, when it came to media, we were promised that media would benefit, small newspapers, all this kind of thing. Nothing of that happened. We have new monopolies. What about venture, Keith? As always, it's changing. You have a particularly keen interest in venture. You've got your own little venture startup. How connected is the changes in venture to the changes in banking? Because it seems like the pieces that you're linking to this week suggest that the traditional finance businesses are getting into the venture industry. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, there's a range of stories. The best is a long essay by Mark Suster, who's from Upfront Ventures in Los Angeles. It's really, really good and really worth reading because it's a survey of the entire landscape.
Yeah.
And he talks about some of the trends we've talked about on the show here over recent weeks. and that's reinforced again. This is stuff we've been ahead of. Goldman Sachs saying that hedge funds are increasingly competing for venture deals, which we've talked about, muscling into Silicon Valley. A very big percentage of all the money deployed in the last 6 months has not come from venture funds, but has come from hedge funds and PE funds.
And is so? Do we define those big new players like Tiger as a hedge fund or a venture fund, or are they kind of a bit of both?
They're very touchy about what they're described as. They don't like to be called a hedge fund. They don't like to be called a venture fund, and they don't like to be called a PE fund, because actually they're all three. And if you
Yeah.
call them any one, someone within their organization is unhappy. But
Mm.
they're really huge financial conglomerates operating across the value chain.
Yeah.
And there's some other names here this week: Insight Partners, General Atlantic, OrbiMed. There's a growing number of these companies, um, uh, um, and and then there's debt. This is a British-based fund by Nick Brisbane called Forward Partners that we've talked about in the past because it's about to do an IPO,
Mm.
saying he's moving from buying equity to lending money to companies based on their revenue. So moving to debt. Lightspeed Partners moving into Europe. And then, to me, the most interesting article is that Goldman Sachs is taking an asset manager, Peters Hill, public, valuing it at 23 to 30 times its income. And this is yet more evidence of the trend for asset managers to be publicly listed, which is what I think is going to happen to the venture industry ultimately. So a lot going on in venture.
In terms of all these public listings, it's all very well talking about this when the stock market is at record highs. When the bubble pops, which it will, because all bubbles pop, is that going to change or not?
Well, firstly, I don't think there's a bubble. I think there's a smartphone-led, blockchain-led growth surge. I mean, that's real. The amount of money flowing to these companies through revenue is the key difference to the bubble last time. So
Well,
this
but
is
then, the stock market is not being driven by blockchain.
the stock market is partly being driven by blockchain. I invest in some stocks that are related to
No, I
blockchain.
know there are stocks that are uh,
It's being driven
blockchain
by
linked, but
it's
yeah, I
being
mean,
driven.
there's certainly an exuberance, whether it's irrational exuberance is a matter of opinion, but it's record highs. What is the Dow now? 35,000.
It's being driven by here. Let me share this. This is my watch list on Google Finance. Um, by the way, a firm last week's startup of the week went up 37% yesterday. If you'd have watched this show and invested in a firm, you'd have done quite well yesterday. But these companies in this list: Agora, Airbnb, Alibaba, Google, Amazon, Box, C3 AI, DoorDash, Facebook, GoDaddy, Lending Club. These stocks are all up massively due
Yeah,
to growth in revenues, not due to a bubble. So now will it stop? Another way of asking that is, will growth stop? If
yeah.
growth
Well, I
stops,
take that. That's a fair point, and it'll stop. The issue is not whether it stops. The issue is how it stops. Whether it's a bust or whether it will just flatten out. So yeah, as you know, as everybody knows, I'm a bit of a pessimist. I always think that every company has a little bit of the Theranos in them, whereas Keith gives all these tech companies the benefit of the doubt. Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes, Keith, is back in the news. What's she been up to this week?
well, the trial has begun, but the story I chose is a slightly different story. It's coming from the information from Jessica Lessin. And actually, she published this story the day we recorded last week's show, so it was
Yeah,
too late to get in. But I thought it was so poignant that I wanted to add it this week. She basically makes the point that there's this very convenient argument in the Valley that Theranos was not a Silicon Valley venture-backed company because its investor base was kind of a bunch of weirdos who are unusual. and she
Well,
would
they
claim
weren't weird. They were just different. I mean, there was nothing weird
they were
about
different. Well, so she challenges that. She makes the point that she went to a party shortly after Theranos was funded. That was a very traditional party with all kinds of Silicon Valley normal people there, all of whom were flocking around Elizabeth Holmes as if
it.
she
Yeah.
was the star of the show. And let's not forget our good friend Tim Draper was an investor in Theranos. So she's making the point, look, don't try to pretend this wasn't a Valley company. I actually think she's right. I've invested in a life sciences company in the UK that claimed to be able to use the proteins in a blood sample to find various diagnostic ailments that a person is suffering from. And to be honest, nobody who invested in that company knew how real the science was, because the science is so hard. You kind of have to, you do due diligence, but even other scientists don't really know if it's true.
Did Jessica? Did she say anything about Holmes's defense? This idea that her boyfriend, co-founder,
No.
was to blame. I was talking to a quite a prominent defense lawyer about this strategy, and they weren't particularly impressed. It's a very odd strategy, I think, to blame someone else when she was the star and the central figure in it all, and that she was controlled by this guy. And in the age of Me Too, it's unusual and interesting.
Well, in a when you have multiple founders in a startup, think about the startup you and I did with Barry Spencer back
Yeah.
in the day, Santa Cruz Networks. Barry said he could make 200 people on a video call work. Okay. Now we saw it. We saw stuff working. I was the CEO. You were senior sales. Um, the truth is we trusted Barry, and you have to, right? That's how
Are
it
you
works.
saying that Barry wasn't telling the truth, Keith?
No, Barry was a good guy. He was telling the truth. But that relationship between the person on a team who is the
Yeah, but
knowledgeable.
with I buy that. But with Theranos, it was such a dog and pony show. It was such a clear fraud that they were just making up the results. There was nothing ambivalent or ambiguous about it.
What?
And she knew that. So the idea that she's blaming this man who she said controlled her and intimidated her seems
Well,
a very
that
weak
that
defense.
that bit I think you and I both agree on. The bit that's harder is with hindsight, of course, everything you say makes sense. But at the actual time, it wasn't obvious. It became obvious
Yeah.
only later.
Well,
So
it's too good to be true. Although sometimes I guess things that are too good to be true turn out to be true.
yeah,
But it probably was equal to Enron as a fraud. Not probably, certainly, right? I mean, Theranos.
yeah. I actually would love to know the truth about when she realized that, because I doubt it was at the beginning.
Well,
I
someone had to be making the decision that they were going to cook the results and just make stuff up. It's hard to believe that she didn't know about it. Someone had to. There needed to be a very very senior person who was telling people to make the stuff up. It wasn't just
Yeah.
people. Anyway, the Chinese are putting their foot down when it comes to billionaires. It's an interesting model. We talked about Apple and monopolies. The future of tech in America is going to be played out in the courts and in organizations like the FCC, whereas in China, it's coming directly from the government, from the authoritarian government. What are the Chinese up to in terms of, as you put it, Keith, taming billionaires?
So there's a couple of elements to this story. The first is how shocking it is that the Chinese mannerism, the language they use to describe these billionaires, clearly has not yet met woke California, because the language they describe them is as super rich sissy boys, um, which
Yeah.
which, which has all kinds of terrible
I don't know what
connotations.
it actually means. I mean, I don't know how that translates in Chinese, but
It did kind of grab my attention. Anyway, the core of it is this idea of common prosperity,
yeah.
or the common good. And in response to the Chinese Communist Party framing the near future as needing to include common prosperity, this week vowed to give 10 billion, 100 billion RMB, which is about $15 billion, to the Common Prosperity Initiative. So, which is kind of like weird because it isn't tax; it's kind of a gift, and so you can see that what's going on here is a you scratch my back, I'll scratch your
Yeah.
back kind of negotiation, which is kind of feudal in its characteristics. You know, it's like the baron who owns the land promises not to invade the guy next door's land as long as he gives him
Yeah.
some
Well,
of the
it's certainly
bonus.
one way to manage tech. I mean, I am no fan of the Chinese government or that strategy, although, the US strategy of allowing multi-billionaires to decide where their money goes and treating it as philanthropy is also, I think, in some ways quite problematic. But certainly the Chinese have a way of doing things and of controlling these companies, which is very different from the United States. We are at my favorite time of the week, startup of the week, Keith. Really interesting company this week.
Yeah. Now, the question about this one, Andrew, is can we believe the science? The startup of the week is a company called Mammoth.
Yeah.
Mammoth is a bioscience company using CRISPR technology, which is basically the ability to program biology,
Genes, yeah.
genes, and their specialism, which they developed in a garage. Um, uh, uh, the venture fund NFX, James Currier, who's a good friend of mine, seems to be the investor there, or it might be Omri Amirav Drori, one or both of them, wrote this piece, which is an interview with the founders, talking about how they managed to discover all these proteins and document them in the human anatomy, whereas large, pharmaceutical companies were not able to do it, and they did it in a garage, and they're now a unicorn. So they're my startup of the week, and it's a really good test of the Theranos theory, because at this moment in time, if you were to ask me if it's real, my answer is I think it must be, but I have no clue because it's bioscience. And they are not yet at the application stage, they're at the discovery stage.
Yeah. I mean,
So
how, in very broad terms, is CRISPR one of the next big things on the investment front? I mean, biotech's already, it's not on the horizon. It's a reality, right?
biotech's been around for decades, so it's just getting cleverer and cleverer. And CRISPR, my kids in elementary school have a science fair, and the Stanford department that does CRISPR all come to help at the science fair. And I spent some time talking to the students.
Mm,
And what I try to understand is how can if the human body is like a computer with strings of characters that denote your DNA, and if you can program those strings of characters to change your genetics, what does that lead to? And if you combine that with stem cells plus CRISPR equals fixing anything or growing anything, actually. So suddenly biosciences starts to sound very futuristic. If you're a pessimist, you'd be scared of what might happen, and if you're an optimist, you'd be thrilled by what might happen, and probably both are true.
right.
Uh,
So CRISPR is the future. No one's doubting that. Let's end with tweet of the week, which is the reverse of the future. It's a blast into the past, Keith. What's the tweet of the week?
the tweet of the week is that another name recognition for me, Jim Lanzone, who goes all the way back to when TechCrunch was founded, is the new CEO of Yahoo.
Does Yahoo
Um,
still exist? I guess they're
no,
probably still doing quite good revenue. Who owns Yahoo now?
Yahoo was just acquired from Verizon by a private equity firm, very much in on topic for us. They're called Apollo, and it's been spun out now as a private company by Apollo
Yeah.
with a new CEO. And this is Bill Gurley, who also knows Jim Lanzone is really well known in the Valley. Everyone knows him. He's a Valley guy, basically. He's done a lot of different things.
Yeah.
So everyone's cheering from the sidelines that Jim will do something at Yahoo better than what's been happening for the last 20 years.
Does Yahoo have a chance, Keith? Does it need CRISPR technology to quite literally reinvent itself or re-architect itself? Because it seems really archaic now.
Well, like
About
the thing about
I
Jim,
mean, it's four chapters old.
the thing about Jim Lanzone is he's one of those people that won't screw up the 150 million daily users that use it. He'll keep on keeping on, but he's an innovator, so he's going to try to figure out how to leverage those assets into something relevant to the future. That's in his DNA. So I would predict that something interesting will happen. I don't know what.
Yeah. Well, we're going to keep on keeping on. Keith Tier and I. We might not do a show next week because I have to go to Kazakhstan. I'm going to be hunting mammoths out there. But we'll be back for more on tech. Yahoo, perhaps not. Certainly Apple, Google, Facebook, and above all else, venture and crypto. Keith, have a good week or two, and we'll be back again in the not too distant future.
Will do. Bye, everyone.